Welcome back to CBSN Originals. We've been talking tonight about the appeal of ISIS and its hold on young Muslims angry at the way they've been treated in their own country. But now we want to turn to the United States. And the question here is, does ISIS have the same appeal for young Americans as it does among the youth in Europe? Farah Pandith, you're joining us from London. I want to figure out and have you explain to us, is there the same kind of marginalization in the United States as we've seen in France?
When I was working at the Department of State, my job was outside of the United States, working on behalf of our country to engage with Muslims around the world. But that unique perspective afforded me the chance to say this. The ideology has no borders. And we've talked in the earlier segment about how the extremist ideology is targeted for Muslim millennials, those under the age of 30 who are digital natives. So obviously America is not immune. And I think we have a lot to learn in the last few years, because I think we were very complacent thinking that because of this particular American narrative, we were a little bit more inoculated than around the world. And certainly the issues that have happened in the events that have happened in the last couple of years, the Boston bombing and other things, have demonstrated to us that we are not protected the way we thought, that the ideology of the us and them has impacted American youth in a very particular way, and that we need to be very cognizant of the fact that we need to build resilience in every one of our 50 states. And I think what you're seeing right now is a sea change in terms of awareness and understanding by communities themselves. And that really is, Vlad, where the answers lie. It is not a top-down approach. It is really a bottom-up approach in how we can build resilience and inoculate and protect our young kids from the extremist ideology that is mostly affecting them in the online space.
Frank, what is Homeland Security, the government, straight up from those departments that are meant to keep us safe, to the President of the United States doing to combat the things that Farah's talking about?
Couple of quick thoughts on that. I mean, firstly, the pace and the scale in terms of incidents we're seeing in the United States is increasing. The op tempo is increasing. By no means at the same scale and scope as they're seeing in Europe. We've had approximately 250 Americans either travel or attempt to travel to fight alongside ISIS and other jihadist organizations in Syria and Iraq. In Europe, it's thousands. But these numbers are no longer onesies and twosies. They're becoming more significant. We had an arrest of more than one a week in average in 2015. When you look at the demographic, and my colleagues did a major study looking at ISIS in America at GW, and they were able to break out the age group as about 26. The demographics are very diverse from a number of converts. In this case, approximately 40% of the arrests were people who converted to Islam in the United States. So we are seeing the numbers increase. By no means at the same scale and scope of Europe. And I do think, though, the difference is in Europe, you've got a hybrid threat. Those that have actually traveled, they have the training, they have the expertise. In the U.S., you have a bit of a problem there, but you have a bigger problem of those that are inspired ideologically but may not have the same training level that some of those joining up with ISIS and returning have in Europe.
And Felix, you know, one of the things I think that is scary for a lot of people here is that there has been a discussion, and we've been talking about it when it comes to Europe, of economic disadvantages. But sometimes these arrests that have happened here in the United States, when you look at the profile of the people the Justice Department is looking at, you're looking at these guys growing up in middle-class neighborhoods, being perhaps targeted by cybersecurity or by cyber threats, but they're not in the same boat as some of the folks in France. So why is that?
Well, clearly, I mean, if the people who blew themselves up were the poorest people in the world, they would be coming from different countries. And they would be coming, they wouldn't be homegrown in America, they wouldn't be in France, they wouldn't be elsewhere. Most of them would be coming from sub-Saharan Africa. They're not, you know, apart from Boko Haram, the phenomenon is not it's not widespread over there. I think like one of the big problems that we have is that Muslims and non-Muslims alike tend to think that the only people who are legitimate in defining what Islam is in 2016 and in the past 50 years are the Arabs. There's an unhealthy Arabocentrism that has basically taken over our minds, both Muslims and non-Muslims alike. The largest Muslim organization in the world is not Arabic. It's not Arab. It's Indonesian.
Indonesia, right.
The Nahdlatul Ulama, We should be engaging these people. There are 50 million people. We can dissolve Wahhabism and Salafism and the Muslim Brotherhood within the broader Islam. There's 1.3 billion Muslims in the world. 2/3 of those are Asians. We can, if Asian Islam and sub-Saharan African Islam and Western Islam, whether from the US or from Europe, comes together with the progressive Muslims of the Middle East, we can win this battle.
You know, keying off of what Felix is saying, but also going back to what Farah said about this knows no borders, at the same time, the numbers of Indonesian recruits heading off to Syria and Iraq is going on 1,000 at this point. So this doesn't know parameters. This doesn't know a border. I can't speak to what was said earlier about the sea change in communities here in the U.S. In terms of this problem. I can speak to a sea change within law enforcement and the intel community in terms of understanding the importance now of making inroads into those communities. And at the end of the day, I mean, obviously we have to work on all these other major 30,000-foot issues, but the opportunity to identify, disrupt, prevent something from happening with someone who is turning to the dark side is through that immediate family, basically. It sounds simplistic,
right,
but to be able to reach into the communities, develop some level of trust through law enforcement. And also from an operational perspective, it's obviously healthy. We develop sources of information. But you have to get to the point where those communities feel emboldened to say, you know what, my son has stopped going to mosque, or something's happened to him. You can imagine how heavy a lift it is to ask a mother or a father or a brother or a sister to pick up the phone and drop a dime on their family member, but we have to get to that point.
But Mike, you know, you spent a lot of time in the intelligence community with the CIA. A lot of people who are watching this are going to say, you know what, I get it. There's got to be a sea change in the way people consider Islam. I get it. There are people around the world who feel economically depressed. But you know, in San Bernardino, the things that happened there, the officer in Philadelphia who was just attacked like that, the question I think a lot of people are going to have is, when you hear politicians, leading politicians saying we need to do something to stop Muslims from coming into this country, we need to do something drastic and let them figure out all those other things you guys are talking about. Is that feasible? Is that feasible from a law enforcement perspective, from an intelligence perspective, or is it something that could further inflame, make people angrier?
Well, first of all, I mean, the idea that we're going to stop all Muslims from coming in here is just insane. That's a ridiculous proposition. And I would hope to think that nobody actually takes that overly seriously, other than thinking, well, we've got a candidate who might say that. What is more logical and what can be done is, of course, on the simple things, the things that we tend to forget about because everybody's on one side or the other screaming at each other. We never look for simple solutions in the center. One of those is, yes, fine, let's look at the vetting process and let's come up with a reasonable way to do that in an efficient manner so it benefits us, it benefits our allies, benefits the communities that want to come into this country. There are certain steps that you can take in operational activity. Can we work closer with private sector in terms of not allowing these communications to go dark? As Frank had mentioned earlier, the need for us to be able to push forward on that. I think that's doable if we take away the emotion, the ability to work with the communities, as I mentioned before, and to develop a better ability to reach into those communities. That can be done.
So stand by 1 second, Felix. I want to ask Frank, the things that Mike is talking about, how would you grade our capabilities right now in the United States, given that we've had in just the last couple of years, going back to Boston and most recently in San Bernardino, some attacks here? How would you grade the capabilities of our law enforcement and our intelligence agencies?
You know, difficult to give a grade that can be comprehensive. I think Mike's spot on in terms of what the integers are and what it is we need to be addressing. But when we look at state and local law enforcement, it's just that. It's going to be what you see in L.A. won't necessarily be the same as you see in New York. And NYPD, LAPD are the gold and silver standard in the United States. But when you look at state by state, community by community, obviously you're going to have different levels of capability, different levels of capacity, but ultimately it does come down to trust. and we need to build trust. Mike was spot on. It's friends and family, but we also need to find ways to build trust with our local law enforcement authorities and do so in a way where it's not seen as purely a law enforcement mission, but one where you can have an honest conversation about difficult sets of issues.
You want to jump in, Felix?
Yeah, absolutely. We really need to have those honest conversations. And I think, frankly, as a Muslim, that we have a huge responsibility. The Muslim community has a history of basically like keeping a low profile, not, taking, not looking at things at straight value. We have a tendency as Muslims, when we see people who purport to be of our faith, who commit barbaric acts, we have a tendency to distance ourselves. This has nothing to do with Islam. The truth of the matter is, every single barbaric thing that ISIS does, they found in a book. There's some of the classics of Muslim literature that are in Al-Azhar, that are in the greatest centers of learning of Islam, say things like you should cut off the head of you should stone the adulterer, you should cut off the head of the apostate, etc.
So
we have to say, where I was saying earlier on, for a long time, Christianity has had very strange behavior with non-Christians. The truth of the matter is, there is a contemporary problem with Islam. And as Muslims, the least we can do is recognize.
Farah, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I did. The point that was made about what's happening here in the United States vis-a-vis law enforcement, I did want to expand that, because there's one aspect to the things that we've learned over the 14 years since 9/11 in terms of law enforcement and the way in which we engage, because I think that's a really important point. The Department of Homeland Security, Secretary Johnson, is being very innovative in the way in which he is going out to build community trust across the United States and to find ways in which we can find new partnerships and build new platforms for ideas that come from the community to be able to push back and build resilience. Because at the end of the day, the things that we have learned over the course of the time since our country was attacked on 9/11 is that the most profound counter-narratives that can affect young people and prevent them from finding sympathy in the us and them narrative comes from communities themselves. Not one community, but the various communities across America. And let's remember that American Muslims are the most diverse group of Muslims anywhere in the world. And we should be mining the content from all of these different types of ethnicities and backgrounds to find and build the kind of movement in America that can make a difference. And what I have seen, when I talk about the sea change that's happened, Secretary Johnson has been very forward-leaning in how he thinks about this and sees the opportunities that come directly from communities. And I don't like to think about the fact that we have to learn lessons from Europe, as we look at what's happening here in the United States, because the point that was made earlier, at one point there were only 1 or 2 cases in the United States. We now have 250, and that number is growing. Both men and women. Let us not forget that there is a change there too in terms of who's being radicalized. But I am absolutely optimistic that there are things that we can learn about how communities can build the kind of resilience that's needed by demonstrating to the many different types of audiences in that peer group that there are ways to think differently about being Muslim and modern in the 21st century, and how we think about being Muslim in America. And I think that that's very important for us to go back to what we need to do to think about how to build a safer and more productive approach to countering the extremist ideology in the homeland.
I'm going to give everybody a round robin as we do some final thoughts, but I just want to touch upon one thing. Frank, the difficulty I think that a lot of Americans will say as they watch this is, look, after San Bernardino, California had a very, very quick reaction to what they thought was a threat to the school system there, and they closed all the schools. New York City said that they received the very same threat and they didn't take it seriously. So the question is, where is that balance? How are these, we talk about using the community, using our eyes and our ears. If you see something, say something. But because the threat is so it's so nefarious, but also so difficult to pinpoint, how can even law enforcement figure out what to do when these situations arise?
Vlad, that's an excellent question. You really can call it a tale of two cities. They both received very similar information, but understandably, right on the heels of San Bernardino, when you've got a number of school officials receiving threatening emails, you could see how LA and LA County would respond differently than perhaps New York. So at the end of the day, there is an art to it, there's a science to it, and unfortunately, we've got to recognize that we have a legitimate threat on our hands, and that is part of that solution set. But it will never come from the top down. Washington will never come up with all the answers, nor should they, and ultimately it's going to be implemented and executed at the local level. And here you saw it play out very differently in LA than it did in New York.
Felix, let me get final thoughts from you. And also, you've received a lot of death threats for some of the things that you've said, and specifically some of the things you just said right here on this special, which is that there have been some people that have said, Islam is the religion of peace. We don't condone these things. You're saying here right now that in Islam there are moments or there are things written down that have led people to commit these atrocious acts.
Yeah, and well, at some point in history, in the 16th century, the people who were running around killing people and being very intolerant with other religions were the Christians. And back then, Muslims were the ones who had a tendency to be much more understanding with other faiths than the Christians. And these days, that's not the case, and we have to recognize it. There is a problem. There's a common denominator between Boko Haram, ISIS, Salman Rushdie, blowing up the Buddhas, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda. There is a common thread, and that thread is that all these people say that they're Muslims. And we have to recognize that as Muslims, we have a problem. So I say, Medina, Mecca, we have a problem.
Mike, final thoughts.
Yeah, we have to be smart enough to multitask, to deal with this on all the different complex layers that this problem makes up. We sometimes get lost. I worry here in the United States we have this attention deficit disorder, or we dumb everything down into a sort of a very basic soundbite solution. That's not the way this is going to work. I would argue, and I've gotten pushback in the past talking about the importance of this community policing, or whatever you want to call it, the ability to develop these relationships and the trust, if you can call it that. Hopefully we get to that point. But I've gotten pushback from people who say, it's too touchy-feely. I don't care. There's a problem. Let's go after the problem. And I'm thinking, you have to understand, okay, aside from the fact that it's the right thing to do, from an operational perspective, it's the right thing to do. So there's an efficiency in what we're talking about. We have to be smart enough to understand how difficult this is. Going after the root causes of this thing, whether it's poverty, whether it's disengagement, whether it's this inability to bring people into the fold as a nation, whatever it may be. And the problem is we're also trying to deal with an increasing number of risks, as was pointed out during this show, both here in the Homeland and elsewhere. As the U.S. is stepping off the stage, and we're dealing more in unilateralism here from the U.S., that's creating a problem. That's creating a chaos and a vacuum up top. The EU is more insecure and divided than it's been since World War II. I mean, or since the development of the EU. And so we've got a real problem here. But we have to be smart enough to deal with it, again, on all the various layers.
And I find it very interesting that in the wake of those terrible attacks in France, French President François Hollande said that France would still be on track to take in some 30,000 refugees from Syria into France, even in the wake of those attacks.
But they wouldn't come. They don't want to come to France. That's the new phenomenon, is that these refugees, it used to be countries that chose their migrants. What we're seeing now, it's migrants choosing their countries. And when François Hollande sent those buses to Munich to fill them up with Iraqis and Syrians, they said thanks, but no thanks. Marine Le Pen, the far-right leader, has 30% of the vote. There's 15% on average unemployment levels in France. Migrants are not stupid. They go where there's jobs.
This is not going to be fixed overnight. I want to thank you all for just a great conversation. Farah Pandith in London, Frank Cilluffo in Washington, Mike Baker and Felix Marquardt here in New York with me. Thank you all very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vlad.
Thank you, Vlad.